Kia ora, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou, e na rangatira mā nau mai, haere mai, whakatau mai ki tēnei hui mariko. Ko Barry Kotaho ko te kārahi o te patea whaiwhakaro. Nā reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa, tihe moriora. A warm welcome to you all. I'm Barry Coates, I'm CEO for Mindful Money. This is the third in the second seminar in our third seminar series. And from now on, these are going to be held on Wednesdays at 12 midday each 2 weeks, but they are, of course, widely available on all good websites and podcasts. Last week, we talked about international climate change negotiations. And this week, we're carrying on the climate change theme, and we're talking about how your investment can make a difference on climate change. Before I start, I should let you know we're going to be talking about some specific funds and some people involved in funds management during the seminar. I should say the seminar is about investment strategies and is not providing financial advice for any individual or any recommendation to invest in any particular fund. So that's a disclaimer out of the way. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Sir Jonathon Porritt. And welcome, Jonathon, to New Zealand, where he has spent much of his life. Jonathon has been, as many of you know, Director of Friends of the Earth prior to attending the Earth Summit in 1992, which is described as a life-changing experience. Jonathon then went on to found Forum for the Future. He was chair of the UK Commission on Sustainable Development for 9 years and is a prolific author. Most recently, his book, Hope and Hell, is a personal search for hope in the climate emergency. So a very warm welcome, Jonathon. Thank you so much for joining us on your visit to New Zealand.
Thank you. Kia ora.
Jonathon, can you start by giving us your perspective on the role of private sector investment in tackling climate change?
I think people are at last coming to terms with just how important that is. I've never subscribed to the view that this emergency is going to be resolved primarily by business, because for me, if governments don't set the right rules for the way markets operate, then frankly, businesses will always be adrift of what they need to do. But having said that, and in the hope that governments will get better at setting these enabling rules for how markets operate, then the role of business, and particularly the role of investors, is going to become absolutely critical, because we're talking about the flow of trillions of dollars from an old world way of creating wealth, which entails destroying the planet, to a new world way of creating wealth, which depends on cohabiting with the planet. And that is just a massive transformation, which has got to be engineered in really quite a short period of time. So finance flows, capital flows, how markets operate to make that work is right at the heart of the challenge that we're now looking at.
Yeah. So I guess one of the things we're talking about in the seminar is how finance can go from being part of the problem, financing climate change, into being part of the solution, in being an agent for change towards the transition. So people are going to be a bit skeptical about that sort of sudden change of the leopard changing its spots and that sudden kind of reversion to being the good guys.
I think people are very wise to be skeptical, frankly, Barry. I think what we saw at COP in Sharm el-Sheikh recently was something that hasn't been quite so obvious before in all the previous conferences of the parties, and that is that the fossil fuel industries have no intention of giving away their hold on politicians and on power today. They came out from behind the curtain, as it were. They were massively present. They infiltrated all sorts of meetings and negotiation sessions, and really substantively affected the final draft of the Sharm el-Sheikh communique. And for a lot of people who were there, who attend COPs quite regularly, this was a bit of a surprise, because in a way, there's always been an assumption that if we think about this stuff reasonably, intelligently, without confrontation, that we can effect a transition out of fossil fuels without destroying the value that is currently in that massive fossil fuel sector. And we can do this without a sort of crash in capital markets. Well, it doesn't look like that now. And you only have to look at the way the big oil companies, the independent oil companies and the national oil companies, are now doubling down on their hydrocarbon investments in a quite astonishing way. And so for me, it's very simple, whether you're talking about big stuff or very small stuff, what we do as individuals, getting out of fossil fuels and not allowing anybody to persuade you that those fossil fuel companies have a reasonable role to play in affecting the transition. That, honestly, is rule number one. Get out of fossil fuels.
And so the role then of the investment community is both to shift their capital, but also to influence those fossil fuel companies. And that's one of the things we're going to be talking about in this seminar. Do you see some examples of good practice where the investment sector is able to play a positive role, and kind of in a way be a force for good in that climate transition?
Yes, absolutely. And every year we see the amount of new investment, particularly in renewable energy, renewable electricity, but also now increasingly on regenerative agricultural alternatives and things like that. We see that total quantum of new investments rising, so that we're now probably at around 40%, 400 billion of the $1 trillion of investment that we're told is required every year to make this transition work fast enough. And that is crucially important to see that figure rise. It has to be said at the same time that that hasn't necessarily substituted for the fossil fuels. It's been additional to the fossil fuels. So what we have to see now is the $400 billion new investment in energy and other ways of creating wealth sustainably. We have to see that replace the investments in fossil fuels rather than just be supplementary to them.
Great, good. Jonathon, obviously New Zealand's sitting on the end of the world, and we're not a major player in these investment markets. Can you see a role where New Zealand could potentially be not necessarily a leader, but providing some innovation or impetus to play a positive role?
Yeah, I do. I think that there's a very real prospect of leadership in a number of areas. The whole TCFD process, which has been rumbling for a long time, has of course moved forward here in New Zealand. Just talking to a couple of people involved in what this means for the financial services sector, they're all saying this new regulation and the mandatory disclosures is going to have a massive effect on the way in which we now manage our assets, the way in which we now provide different financial services and different products, and how the banks themselves actually look at their own behaviors to reduce emissions and so on. Secondly, it may be small and you're probably all quite used to it, but the KiwiSaver initiative that you have here in New Zealand is quite significant. It does allow for modest choice to ensure that your pension through KiwiSaver is actually avoiding doing harm, even if at the moment, if I've understood this correctly, Barry, even if at the moment you can't proactively opt into a particular KiwiSaver option that allows you to preferentially favor the good, the positive investments in renewable energy, whatever it might be. So these are important. They may be small, but they're important. And those things are picked up elsewhere in the world.
Yeah. And that point about people being able to invest in things that they really care about and to do some positive good is just, as we discussed, just starting. in some
Yeah.
of the mainstream KiwiSaver and investment markets. But as you say, it's impossible to find any dedicated funds that are available to retail investors. We'll talk about later on in the seminar about some wholesale
Yeah.
options later. Let me just introduce something to the audience. We've done some calculations on the amount of what's called financed emissions, financed carbon emissions in the average KiwiSaver account. And people are very well aware of their carbon, the idea of a carbon footprint. You have a carbon footprint from your electricity use, from your car use, from flying aeroplanes, from eating meat, etc. And all of that totals around 7.7 tonnes on average per New Zealand citizen. On the other side, people have got their investment funds. They generally don't think of the footprint of their investment funds. But if you calculate the what's called the financed emissions in their investment funds, it's about 2.3 tonnes. So it
Yeah.
is one of the biggest components of an individual's carbon emissions. Just like it doesn't automatically go away when you change your investment fund or your investment strategy, but you can influence it to reduce that 2.3 tonnes significantly. And that's what we're going to be talking about in the seminar, is the fact that we can take these set of actions that individually can make a difference, but also collectively when investment funds do them, that's starting to create the conditions where investment funds can be funding the good stuff and not funding the bad stuff and using their influence for good. So we'll talk about each of those issues in a
Yeah,
minute.
no, I think that's hugely, honestly, I think that's so significant. As you can imagine, Barry, over the last 50 years, I've done quite a lot of meetings in my life with different sort of audiences, and it happens all the time that you still get asked, oh, okay, so that's really bad, so tell me, what can I do? And they obviously expect you to go to the usual stuff about energy and travel and food, etc., etc. I've stopped doing that now. I simply say, I bet all of you are quite mindful of what you need to do in your lifestyle, but I bet the vast majority of people in this audience here today have not thought through the implications of your investments, either your pensions or whatever else it might be. And I sometimes get them to stick their hands up to say whether they're doing anything about that or not. They're all a bit sheepish because they know they probably should be, but they're not. They're not. And actually, you've surfaced a figure there, which is 2.3 tonnes of financed emissions. And I haven't had a figure to use in the past. So now I'm going into action, much better informed than I was before, with an actual figure, which I hope will have even more an effect on them than it might otherwise have done. So thank you. That's very useful.
Jonathan, thank you so much for coming onto the seminar, and maybe we'll see you before you go at the end of the seminar.
Thanks.
So
looking forward to that.
Thanks
panel.
very much.
Thank you.
And it is a very self-interested plug for Mindful Money. If anyone wants to look at these issues in their portfolio, they can go to the Mindful Money website and have a look. And that's of course sitting in the chat. So go and have a check out of your portfolio in whatever KiwiSaver investment fund you have, and look also at the climate action page, which shows you what you can do about it. So let's crack on into the strategies of what you can do about climate change in your investment fund. And I'm thrilled that we've been joined by somebody who's eminently well qualified. Dr. Sebastian Gehricke is the head of the Climate and Energy Finance Group at the University of Otago. And Sebastian's a prolific researcher and speaker, and a source of very good connection between academic research and what's actually happening. So really warm welcome to you, Sebastian.
Kia ora, Barry. Thank you for having me and for that very nice introduction. Very humbling.
Well deserved, Sebastian. And can you kick us off and talk about this field of divestment? You know, for many people, they kind of get the idea divestment's kind of not investing in stuff. Um, uh, but can you kind of lead us through what it means on climate change?
Of course. So, Jonathon was talking about different actions that investors can take and the significant impact they can have, particularly collaboratively. So that's kind of where I'm starting and where I will end at, hopefully, as well. And so I get to talk about divestment, and our other speakers are going to be talking about some of the other things that, fund managers, particularly also KiwiSaver fund managers, can be doing. And, you as in the audience as clients of these fund managers can either ask them to do it or ask if they are doing it, or pick one that is doing some of these things if you agree with what we have to say today. So I wanted to start off with divestment, and basically divestment, as you kind of hinted to, is pulling your money out of something. It can get a lot more nuanced than that. So divestment can be either based on sort of industry or sectors. So a common one is we exclude oil and gas companies, or we exclude integrated oil and gas companies, or anything like that, and we don't invest in those companies as a fund manager. The other way that some managers are approaching this is through what we call sort of an exposure-based screen or divestment, where they look at, if a company makes, say, more than 10% of its revenue from fossil fuel extraction, then they won't invest. Right? So there's different ways of classifying how you divest, and I think that's quite important, that you understand what the fund you're invested in, how they actually divest. But of course, mindful money is an easy way to look at that, where it sort of just shows you how much are they holding right now, and then you don't necessarily need to know as much about how they got to that point. You know what they have, right? So, kudos to you, Barry. I've referenced your website a lot to people asking what can they do as a sort of first step. Now, the underlying question, I think, when we think about, why should we be in a KiwiSaver fund or in a fund in general that divests from fossil fuels, which is mainly what we're talking about today. And, that's an individual decision, and there's sort of two aspects to it. One is, how do you want to earn your retirement money, right? So that's more of a moral, ethical sort of question where, do you want to retire on money that's been made from something that's destroying the planet, right? Do you want to be benefiting from that industry? So that's the first question. The second question is, what risks and opportunities do you actually want to be exposed to in your investment portfolio? Right. So when we look at climate change, which is mainly what links to the fossil fuel industry, although there's many other issues that they impact on, it's, there's what we call physical risk, transition risk, and liability risk. So physical risk is a pretty obvious one. It's, increased or higher sea levels, increased droughts in some places, increased flooding in other places. And these events, extreme weather events, can actually negatively impact these companies, right? So you imagine you have an office building like the one I'm sitting in right now near the ocean, and then there's sea level rise. Now that's not worth anything, right? Well, it has a lot of damage, and so that's a financial risk. So if your portfolio is invested in companies that hold such assets, you're actually financially exposed to that physical climate change risk. More pertinently, in the nearer term, there is what we call transition risk. And so that's the risk that what the company you invested in does is replaced by something else. And then there's also liability risk, which is, changing regulations, being sued, etc. So the question there, again, just bringing it back, is, what kind of risk do you want to, or what do you want to be exposed to? So it's more of a financial question, right? Do you think climate change is a problem? Do you think the companies causing it are going to lose value, right? If they have coal power plants, or they're selling oil and then they're not allowed to sell that anymore after some time. These sorts of questions, right? So it's may even be financially prudent to not be invested in those companies if we're looking forward rather than just backward or just this year. And then Oh, sorry.
Sebastian, can I just follow up on that
Yeah.
point? So this issue of kind of what's called stranded assets. So all of the oil and gas reserves or coal reserves that companies can never use without frying the planet. That's sitting as a balance sheet kind of asset, like a benefit for the company. But if you can't use it, then they're going to be worthless. And that concept's been around since pretty much a decade. Do you see that risk increasing as we get closer to the time when we can't be expanding oil and gas any further, where we're really making a transition to renewable energy?
Yeah, I believe so. And you look at there's this list called the Carbon Underground 200. It's essentially the 200 companies with the most fossil fuel reserves. And if we were to burn those reserves, I think it's more than 3 times our global carbon budget would be exhausted, right? To stay with, and that carbon budget's to stay near a 1.5 degree world, right? So we really can't. So this idea of stranded assets is, these oil and gas companies or fossil fuel companies, they own, rights to oil and gas and coal in the ground. And currently that has a high monetary value. And that's why investors have this high stock valuation on these companies. However, if they, either through the physical where, a coal plant goes underwater or something along those lines, or through a transition risk, more likely in the near term, a regulation disallows them to extract or burn those fossil fuels. Like in New Zealand, we can have no more oil and gas exploration, right? So these regulations are coming, and so the stranded asset risk is very real. Now, these were all sort of individual questions around what do you want to be exposed to, what do you want to make your money from, these types of questions, right? There's also a collective question, whereas do we want these companies to change, right? Can we impact what they do? And collectively, if enough investors pull their money out, then the company's stock prices are affected. The way they can raise capital is affected, so it becomes harder for them to get more money to build more fossil fuels or more oil wells, right? More assets in that sector, and that should incentivize them to shift what they are doing, right? And there's good research out there now that is actually the case. But I just want to emphasize that's a collective effort, right? So if we look at KiwiSaver, that's quite a large chunk of money now, and it's projected to get really big. That collective chunk of money can really have an effect on what these companies get up to, along with all the investors around the world. So we have to be part of the movement. So there's the individual exposure, risk, and financial sort of materiality of those risks, and what, your moral obligations. And then there's the collective impact that we can have through divestment.
So that's an important point, because a lot of people say, if I don't invest in this fossil fuel company, somebody else will. And I'm not really changing anything if I don't invest in them. But what you're saying is collectively, and I notice on kind of fossil fuels, I'm as well as being head of Mindful Money, I'm also a board member for 350 Te Roa, and 350.org internationally has had this massive campaign that has now persuaded institutions with $40 trillion of funds under management to divest from fossil fuels. So I guess that meets a minimum scale in terms of collective action from divestment that makes divestment very quite impactful for the fossil fuel companies.
Yes, and I have to say there's been research done on this over the years, but the methodologies haven't always been actually getting at the divestment, because divestment is a point in time thing, right? They've been looking at comparing funds, etc. But recently there was a publication in a really good journal, Rohan et al. 2022. I can send through later. But essentially, they have a really good methodology for actually finding actual divestment due to that carbon exposure, right? So they call it decarbonization selling pressure. And then they I won't get into the details, sorry. But it's effectively what they find is that divestment, when it's across the industry, when it's enough, it reduces the stock prices of those companies. And it's not just a short 1 month reduction, it's over several years. And the really interesting thing is that they found is that those companies that were divested from actually decreased their carbon intensities after that point in time. So it hurt their capital raising ability, and so they actually changed what they were doing. It's one of the first really good studies that's actually getting at this problem. So I just want to add that.
So, Sebastian, can you put that in the chat in case people
Sure,
who
I'll
want to
put a link
dive to the
through.
next level of detail are prepared to do that? That would be great. Let me bring in Leah. Leah, so we're looking now at the second major strategy for dealing with climate emissions, and we're talking about engagement or influencing companies where they're part of an investment manager's portfolio. So Leah is an investment analyst for Mercer, one of the leading fund managers in New Zealand. She specialises in sustainability and is passionate about sustainability. So Leah, welcome to you.
Thanks, Barry. That was a really good discussion on divestment and how it can be quite a powerful tool, but it's not the only tool that we as investors have in our tool belt. So for those who are unfamiliar with the concept of engagement or what engagement is defined as a purposeful, targeted communication with an entity on particular matters of concern with the goal of encouraging change at an individual issuer level, or the goal of addressing a market-wide or system risk. So for example, climate change. And this means it's a really useful tool for investors, means engagement can be a really useful tool for investors in driving change within companies. Engagement, unlike divestment, unfortunately is quite time consuming though. The process, simply by the fact that change takes time. And what investors are asking for, particularly in the context of climate change, can seem like quite lofty requests to company management, which is why when investors do choose to engage, they spend quite a bit of time in that sort of due diligence process before going to the company. So from a very high level, what the engagement process looks like is identifying priority topics. So for example, emission reductions. We would then choose targeted companies, so like electricity generators, and then setting objectives for each of the engagements, so net zero targets could be one. Once these objectives are then defined, investors then determine what mediums of engagement they're going to use, because there's a few different ways you can engage with a company. So for example, you could send a letter to the CEO, or you could pull with other investors and use that collective voice, or what Sebastian was saying earlier, that collective voice to communicate the broad view of investors to a company. And then once you've got that method in place, you then look at how you're going to escalate that, because not all engagement efforts are received with rosy sunglasses in the first instance. So an example of sorry, Barry?
Yeah, carry on. Because I was going to say it'd be great to lead us through an example.
Yeah. So an escalation could be in a few different ways, and it also varies depending on what asset class you're in. So when you're an equity investor, you have voting rights, whereas when you're a debt holder, you don't. But you, as an equity investor, you could vote against board re-election, or as a bond holder, you could refuse the refinancing of bonds. And then once you've got this sort of broad view of what you're going to do, who you're targeting, and how you're going to get there, that's when you start engaging with companies. And generally, it's investee companies that are targeted, so for a couple of reasons. So when a company improves, generally benefits the investor, but also because as an owner, you have leverage. So as I was saying before, voting against board members. So targeting a company board is quite a common escalation method for investors. So a company's board is responsible for protecting shareholders' interests. So they establish policies for management. They provide oversight of the corporation or organisation and make decisions about important issues that a company or organisation faces. So when investors feel that the board isn't adequately responding to these engagement efforts, they can signal this to the board by voting against re-election and then following that up with why they voted against re-election. what happens is if dissent is high enough amongst that group of investors, it will actually result in the replacement of board members, which with time generally results in a shift in strategy because the new board members coming in tend to be aligned with the investors who voted the old members out. So I realise that this sounds quite broad and it's more, I've been talking to more of the process, so I just wanted to also give you an example of, or a live example where engagement has worked. So one of the managers that Mercer employs, all the way back in 2018, so a long time ago, started engaging with ENN Energy Holdings. They're a Chinese company. Using that process, they set 7 different objectives that they wanted from the engagement, one of which was to start publicly reporting greenhouse gas emissions. After multiple engagements over multiple years, the company now publishes verified emissions reports and has subsequently set emissions reduction targets, which is fantastic. And this has resulted in investment in alternative energy sources like biomass, which has saved thousands of tonnes of carbon emissions entering the atmosphere. So yeah, engagement does work, it just takes a little bit longer.
Yeah. So and it is obviously very hard to influence companies, as you said. Some are pretty reluctant to change. It's good that we're now starting to see some reports coming out that not only talk about the engagement the fund managers do, but talk about the results and the outcomes of those and whether companies have changed. Are you seeing that becoming a little bit more common? I know Mercer produces one of those reports.
Yes, we do, and it absolutely is becoming more common because, what's the point in engaging if you're not going to get an outcome? Like, it's the so what. So, what steps have you taken now that they're not working? What steps are you communicating with other investors? Are you banding together? Like, why are you engaging? Is a really important element of the engagement process. So, yeah, we definitely are seeing more, and I expect to see more results as the stewardship code picks up pace in New Zealand, or is picked up by more managers.
Yeah. So as Leah said for the audience, there's a new code on engagement, or often called stewardship. And that stewardship code has just been launched and in New Zealand, and it's kind of like a principles for best practice guide for engagement, for reporting on the engagement, etc. So we'll be talking more about that later on in the seminar series. But Leah, thank you, and we'll come back to some of those issues when we come back as a panel. I just want to introduce Rohan. Rohan McMahon is a co-founder and partner in the Climate Venture Capital Fund. And this is New Zealand's first such fund. And it's great that Rohan has joined us to talk about the third major solution. So we've talked about divestment, engagement, and now we're talking about investing in climate solutions. So Rohan, this is obviously you're absorbing your every waking moment around the operation of the fund. Can you talk us through some of the ways that investment can make a difference and some of the things happening in this world of climate solutions?
Absolutely, Barry. Thank you very much. And ngā mihi nui kia koutou ko Rohan McMahon tēnei. Thank you very much for the invitation. Just to start by stepping backwards a little bit, we've talked about divestment, and that's an important element of the way in which people are responding. But you can't divest from everything. We're in a broad economy, and your money does need to go somewhere at the end of the day. So that brings you to engagement, which Leah's just been talking about, and that's certainly an approach where you see a lot of activity and a lot of really progressive responses, in my view. But that still means you're engaging with the fossil fuel economy at the end of the day. And so if you think of a category that might be in your KiwiSaver, that wouldn't be something you'd want to divest from. It's not, a coal stock, but it might be maybe a food and beverage stock. So perhaps it's a supermarket chain. Those products that they sell are wrapped in plastic, and they're transported with diesel trucks, and they're manufactured with process heat that's fossil fuel gas. and the agricultural products that go into there may be produced with may produce methane or may have their own CO2 emissions and the like. So by default, we're all in the fossil fuel economy, and the engagement process is in the fossil fuel economy too. And so that leaves people scratching their heads and thinking, is there another way, or is there another alternative that people can bring to the fore? Because what that means, when you're in the fossil fuel economy, you have the downside risk that comes with that. And what I think I've learned as someone who's pretty interested in climate is that we're still learning just how bad that downside is going to be, but it is going to be bad. So it does lead you thinking, well, what are the alternative approaches, and would those produce any upside for you? So what we do at the Climate Venture Capital Fund is an example of direct investment in private capital that's going towards companies that directly decarbonize. So let me give you an example. The Climate Venture Capital Fund, which I'm a partner in, we take funding either from KiwiSaver funds or the like, or directly from investors who we call limited partners. We provide that towards growth stage companies that have specific decarbonisation goals or emissions reduction goals, and we require that those goals are tangible and measurable, and that the company agrees to help us to measure them and to certify them, and then in due course we can provide those reports on the progress of the emissions reduction back to our investors. That's a growing approach, and you can do that from a private equity fund that might be interested in decarbonisation, or for slightly earlier stage companies, you could invest it through a venture capital fund. There are venture climate tech funds around the world. We're far from the only one, but we are, interestingly, the only one in Aotearoa, and depending on your definition, arguably the only one in Australasia as well, which is really interesting. So there's a lot to be done in this space, and we see that by directly allocating your capital towards something that you care about, you're more likely to drive that direct result. You can do that directly by working with a fund manager of your choice, by going to your private equity fund or your favorite venture capital fund, such as mine, if you wish. But not everyone has those means or the time or the capability to make those decisions. And the amount of money that we have collectively tied up in KiwiSaver in a small economy is substantial. It's an important driver of the way in which the economy is responding to whatever pressures are on it at a given time. So while KiwiSavers are relatively not too involved in this space at the moment, we do expect to see that grow. There was some great research that was released, I'll pop it in chat in a moment, which from the Centre for Sustainable Finance, Toitu Tahua, and the Investor Group on Climate Change and Mindful Money a couple of weeks ago, which showed quantitatively that major investors in this part of the world, whether they're fund managers or asset owners or wealth managers, are less likely to be directing capital towards these sorts of solutions than in Australia. And I can tell you as an Australian that Australians are not that advanced in this space either. So it's a newish area. But the most fundamental part of it is that there are good technologies out there and good firms that are decarbonising, and they need support, they need capital. Now, they can get that from the bank, they can get that from a government grant, but fundamentally they need equity capital, and that's something that people who are interested in climate response can help them with in this sort of growing area.
Yeah. For the audience, one of the things that Rohan's put his finger on is we really need some of our mainstream fund providers, KiwiSaver funds and retail investment funds, to be putting their money into climate solutions. And they can either do it directly, or they can invest in an intermediary, such as a climate venture capital fund or a private equity fund, etc. And so that's a key issue that will be part of the seminar series later on in the series. So we'll have a whole section on that next year around March and April. So that because for many investors, that's the way they can not only avoid bad stuff in their investment, and not only have engagement, but they can have a portion of their portfolio also investing in climate solutions or other positive impact investments. Rohan, can I ask you, so if you invest in renewable energy, that's a kind of a replacement often of fossil fuel driven energy by solar or wind power. Yeah, that has a certain impact, but you're also quite keen to invest in things that have a more transformative impact across lots of different parts of the economy, aren't you? I remember a conversation with you about some companies that you've been looking at.
Yeah, that's right, Barry. We sort of would steer away as a venture fund from investing in a technology where a lot of the hard work's already been done. If it's a wind farm or a solar array or a lithium-ion battery, things that you can more or less buy off the shelf, subject to consenting and those sorts of things, we see those as fantastic and definitely want to support them, but it's not really the sort of thing that we're interested in personally. We want to drive the technology transformation in the really the emissions categories that haven't got those solutions available to them just yet, and make those more commercially successful. So that's pushed us towards the so-called hard-to-abate emissions categories, which is products and services that are essential for us, that we can't do without, but which lack those alternative low emissions options. And that's a space where I think there's a lot to be done. So here in New Zealand, for example, everybody wants to find a fantastic way to reduce agricultural emissions, because at the end of the day, we like to drink milk, and some of us like to eat meat. Not too many of us, as many as used to be, but still a lot of us. So they're products that aren't going away anytime soon, but we do need low emissions alternatives. So we're certainly very interested in that space.
Okay, good. Let me go to questions from the audience. So we've received one question. If anyone wants to add questions, please do so as we draw to the end of the seminar. And it's a question to Leah. Question, thanks for the good explanation of engagement, but the question is still a bit sceptical about how much influence a New Zealand investor with a relatively small scale can have in a global company. And Leah, perhaps you can kind of run through what options are available for New Zealand investors with global portfolios on engagement.
Yeah, so that is a valid concern, and it's also a valid concern that a lot of Mercer's clients have, is we are a small country and not everyone has a large balance, but I guess there's sort of two avenues. So Mercer is a huge investment firm, so the firm has quite a large reach in terms of contacting and having that information flow through our engagement chain, but also from the smaller investor side, you can pull together, and it's that collective effort that Sebastian talked about earlier as well, the collective effort, banding together as investors, working as one unit to make that difference.
And there was a good example from the super fund, who of course engaged after the Christchurch shootings and provided a structure for a lot of investors to be able to tackle Facebook for its dissemination of videos from the Christchurch shootings.
Of objectionable content.
Yeah. So is that the kind of example? But is Mercer part of other collaborations internationally on similar issues?
Yeah, we are. I don't know if I can say too much.
Yeah,
we are.
Yeah. And it's difficult because I think the super fund's own evaluation said that they had limited traction with Facebook in terms of significant changes. So yeah, just one other follow-up question. When you described engagement as taking time, it takes staff time. It's kind of sometimes difficult to do. You guys presumably also facing pressure from your customers, from the FMA, from just about everyone else to reduce your fees. Something's got to give. How does that work out in the thinking of a fund manager to say we need to spend this money, but equally well we need to keep our fees as low as possible?
Well, I think everything's a balance, especially when you speak to the head of a department who's running the cost sheets. But it's that risk versus reward, right? So, and that sort of outlay for the benefit. So are you signing up to this? Are you participating in this? And is it costing a lot of money? And are you going to get that benefit? So talking about that stewardship process where you've got set objectives, you have the outcomes, you know why you're you know why you've set up this process from the outset. that seems like a pretty intuitive step to take, because in theory, if this engagement is successful, you're going to get that change and it's going to be a positive outcome. Whereas if you're going to sign up to something and spend a whole bunch of capital, or have additional money flowing out, and you're not going to get that benefit, especially for your members, then what's the point? So it's all a balance. I guess it's not a specific answer.
Yeah.
It's on a case by case basis. Yeah.
Can I add to that? Is that all right?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So there's a lot of publications on engagement on past issues which weren't around decarbonisation, but even recent. I'm an academic, so this is what I come back to, academic work on the evidence around engagement. And one of the key things you said there, Leah, I think, was the collective engagement, right? Investors need to be collaboratively engaging, and I think the Climate Action 100 Plus, for example, is a great way of doing it. Usually there's a lead engager, and then everyone else in the group, or enough other people that hold that company, back up that engagement, right? And so there's a lot of literature around how those collaborative approaches actually improve environmental outcomes, or measurements, as good as we can measure it, but also improve financial performance as well.
Yeah. So in all of this, there's not necessarily a trade-off between financial performance and good policies on the areas we've been talking about. There's a lot of evidence to say that actually investors can have returns that are at least as high, if not higher, from pursuing good policies around responsible investment or impact investment. Rohan, for you, what are the conditions that you see? I mean, you kind of spend a lot of time around the investment industry. What are the conditions that you see these three strategies working together, where you've got kind of your tools, you've got your divestment, you've got your engagement, you've got your investing in climate solution? How do you see them fitting together?
Well, Barry, in totality, we need an absolutely massive amount of capital towards climate response, and that just is going to require every tool in the toolbox, and probably some tools we haven't thought of yet. So the little slice that I do in venture capital is actually a really small slice, but we hope it's a catalytic slice, because it does tend to bring in additional layers of capital from later stage investors, from project finance as you start to build out, from debt finance providers and the like. And I see that the divestment and the engagement strategies are part of that as well. When you're divesting from one part of the economy, that really does have to mean more money is available for what you're not divesting from by its nature. And when you're engaging, I mean, ESG-friendly strategies will help clean investors and clean companies to do their work. Over time, it's inevitable that more capital will flow towards those sorts of neighbourhoods. I think what's really troubling is, we're seeing an enormous shift towards green capital on the whole, but it's not fast enough. This is the pivotal decade for climate response, and it's great to see that climate bonds or green bonds have gone past the US $1 trillion a year mark. I mean, it's unbelievable amounts of money, and just have way more zeros on it than we talk about in this part of the world. But it's still not sufficient. And because this decade is the decade where we really have to try and turn the emissions curve down, it's something we need to accelerate. And so we're very keen on our part to try and encourage the kind of collaboration that Leah and Sebastian are talking about, because we are all in this together. And we certainly see that this kind of idea of blended finance, where different kinds of investors work together on a particular problem, that's going to be an important part of the solution. So some of that could be government capital, because you see government support for manufacturing process heat decarbonisation, for example, for research into agricultural emissions reduction, those sorts of things. But also for larger investors and later stage investors and people with different risk profiles, there's got to be an opportunity for them to come in to these sorts of solutions along the way, and to add their further weight to the solutions.
Good, thank you for that. And to wrap up, last comments from you, Sebastian and Leah. Sebastian first.
Yeah, I think just everyone shares the responsibility, right? As we've all been saying, collaboratively. and you in the audience likely are sort of in the, retail investor, KiwiSaver investor space. So it's almost your responsibility, along with us, to try and make things transparent, or as managers to try and offer better solutions. As a shareholder, it's your responsibility to ask questions of your fund managers, of your companies, if you can, if you're that big of an investor, and choose responsibly who you invest through, as that will have an impact again as a collective. That's all I'd like to say.
Thank you, Leah.
It's hard to follow that one up. That is definitely a call to action. I think we are in a pivotal moment in time, and as investors, we are in a crucial position to be allocating responsibly. And my final words are thank you, Barry, for helping flesh out what this means and making it tangible and accessible for everyone who's on this call and who will watch this later.
Sure. So thank you all very much to Sebastian, Gehricke, Leah Keys, and Rohan McMahon. That was really good from Mindful Money's perspective. We see a lot of, in a way, ideological argument between the proponents of divestment, the proponents of engagement, and those on positive investing, and it's as if these things are mutually exclusive. Practically, from our perspective, we need to exclude or divest from the worst companies that aren't going to change. We need to engage with those who can get onto a 1.5 degree transition pathway, encourage them to do so, and then we need to invest in the things that are really going to turn the dial in terms of reducing emissions. So there's a very good place for all of these strategies. And for investors, as you can hear, there are ways for you as an investor to make a difference to climate change through your investment decisions. And thanks to the presenters for suggesting you go to Mindful Money to do it. So as a reminder, the seminars are held at midday on every second Wednesday. The next one on 14th of December is the last one for the year, and it takes a deep dive into that engagement question. So we're going to be looking how influence happens, not only from the perspective of the investor talking about engagement, but also from the company that's being engaged with. And so we're going to drill down to understand, how real is this? Under what conditions does it work? What are the real levers, and how can we be sure that it's happening? So please join us Wednesday, 14th of December. Just a thank you to those who help us with sponsorship for the seminar series. We would like to thank Mercer for their sponsorship. New Zealand Green Investment Finance, also a sponsor. Medical Assurance Society, otherwise known as MAS, as a sponsor. And we've just been joined by Chapman Tripp. And I'm pleased to announce Alfinity, a new New Zealand fund, has also joined as a gold sponsor. Also, thanks to Booster, to Harbour Asset Management, who are actually talking on the next seminar. So we're looking forward to that discussion with Harbour, who are known for their engagement work. And thanks also to Trustees Executives Limited. So thank you for joining us, and thanks particularly to Jonathon Porritt. So Jonathon Porritt for making time for us in his busy schedule coming to New Zealand. And again, thanks to all of our panelists. Thanks to you, our audience, for joining us. Ka kite anō, matewa.